Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the final formal panel session of our two-day symposium, Journalism in the Time of Crisis. This is a panel about the evolution of journalism education in the wake of the pandemic. But before we begin with that, we have a special event that we're going to introduce into the schedule. Patricia Elliott from the First Nations University of Canada and University of Regina is joining us, and Patricia is going to launch the new journal from J Schools Canada, a new academic journal called Facts and Frictions. So I want to turn the floor over to Patricia, who is doing like triple duty today because she was on a panel this afternoon. Then she had to duck out to go and teach her class. Now she has a guest speaker who's filling in for her for a few minutes while she rejoins us to launch the journal. So Patricia, please go ahead.
Thank you, and hi everybody. Good to see you all. I'm just going to share my screen. Can you all see that now?
There we are.
Okay, awesome. So normally for a publication launch, I guess we'd have champagne and fancy food. But I'm happy that you're here, and I can just make this announcement from J Schools Canada, which represents journalism programs across the country, that we're very pleased to announce the birth of a new peer-reviewed academic journal, Facts and Frictions, Emerging Debates, Pedagogies, and Practices in Contemporary Journalism. The title comes from a Name the Journal contest winner who is Chelsea DeVito, and she was a Carleton grad student at the time. And I just love that a student won the naming contest. And I love the name that she came up with as well. So we're going to publish on the JSource platform, which is Canada's #1 journalism news website. And the journal will be online only and open access. So in this way, your research is going to receive the widest possible audience. We're seeking scholarly articles, as well as shorter research notes about, for example, research in progress or research findings. Also works of journalism, and what we probably have in mind here is like maybe some graduate student projects or faculty projects, possibly some previously released works with permission of the original publishers, and then reviews, book reviews, film reviews, exhibitions, textbooks, and so on. All these submissions will be blind peer reviewed according to regular academic publishing standards, except for the reviews. And submissions may be in English or French, and they'll be published in the language submitted, with the abstracts being bilingual. And note that we also are accepting podcasts and presentation videos for the notes and reviews, and also works of journalism in any format. So we're reimagining academic publishing, taking full advantage of the multimedia features of an online platform. The deadline for our first issue is May 1st, and the submit button is, as of today, now live. And in addition to faculty research, conference papers and graduate student work is also really encouraged and welcome. We see ourselves as also being a bit of a mentoring role as well. You can find further information on the J Schools Canada website. And I just want to thank you all very much for joining us in this really special moment. So thank you all.
Thank you very much, Patricia. And anyone who has any questions or wants to follow up, feel free to pose those in the Q&A site here. I'll keep track of them, and I'll get them on to Patricia.
Sure. Okay. And I'll look forward to seeing all your submissions.
Great.
Thanks very much. Have a great panel.
Okay. Enjoy the rest of your class.
Thanks.
Okay, so we shall carry on. So I would like to introduce the three panelists who are joining me today. Jennifer Leask is a journalism instructor at both Langara College and UBC. She's a researcher and a former CBC News producer. Jennifer was a lead researcher on a project on teaching journalism in the time of COVID-19 Impacts on Pedagogy and Practice. This was co-authored by my Carleton colleague, Susan Harada. And so Jen will be talking to us primarily about that project. Karen Fowler-Watt is a senior principal academic and formerly head of the School of Journalism, English and Communication at Bournemouth University in the UK, where she is this evening for her. A former BBC journalist, Karen is research theme lead for journalism education in the Centre of Excellence in Media Practice at Bournemouth. Her research interests focus on reporting marginalized voices and reimagining journalism education. Finally, Marin Mckenna is an independent journalist, author, and senior fellow at the Center for the Study of Human Health at Emory University. Marin won the 2019 AAAS Kavli Gold Award for magazine writing for her piece, The Plague Years, published in the New Republic. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Marin has taught an open online course to over 8,500 journalists, a MOOC, about covering news in a pandemic. She previously worked for many years at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, covering the Centers for Disease Control full-time. So that is the group that is joining us today, and we sort of agreed ahead of time that each would take about 10 minutes talking about their work, and then we will get into a discussion. And certainly I encourage anyone who wants to pose a question. There is a Q&A field down in the bottom. So Jen, over to you.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. I want to start by acknowledging that I'm a guest on the traditional and unceded territory of the Squamish and Lillooet people. And I think it's important to start with that acknowledgement generally, but particularly in this forum, because I think what we're trying to do here is look at the shifts that we're seeing in society and in journalism schools and figure out a way to do better. And I think that territorial acknowledgement is something that we've been doing more in journalism schools and is symbolic of that. So when I think about the theme of this, journalism in the time of crisis, I feel like we can say there are lots of industries that are in crisis because of the pandemic. And also I feel that journalism school has not been left aside. We've had problems with what we're trying to do because of the pandemic as well. Yesterday, I was in the session with Teresa Tam, who, if you don't know, is Canada's Chief Public Health Officer. And one of the things she said that really struck me was this idea that the pandemic has put a magnifying glass on the cracks in our system. And I would say that I have seen that for journalism school as well. There are parts of journalism school where there were inequities that maybe we could look away from, or problems with the way we were trying to teach that we didn't see or didn't really notice. And when the shutdown happened in the spring, we couldn't not see those things anymore. And we've had to completely reimagine how we're going to teach from a distance. And so I want to talk a little bit about that in addition to the research that you mentioned that I did with Susan. So Susan Harada, who is at Carleton, and we'd already been doing some research on newsroom values and news values and how those were being shifted in journalism schools. And then in the spring, we decided, okay, we've all had to emergency move online. What are instructors doing and what are they finding with that move? And so if anyone's interested in seeing that research more in depth, there actually is the PDF of some of the slides in the additional documents. But I'm just going to highlight a few of those things here, and I'm going to tell you about what I've seen since we got the data and how I'm seeing that manifest in my own teaching. So there's three things I'd like to mention. One is when this shutdown happened, there was a really negative impact on students and their access to technology. Students are used to being able to go to labs. They're used to being able to get cameras and audio equipment and studio time whenever they need to, and suddenly they didn't have that access. For some students, that was great. They were able to pivot and use their phones. They were really flexible. They probably learned a lot about what it's like when you're working out in a news field and your gear stops working and you have to improvise. But for some students, that was very negative. I have some examples from my own students who, had one student who didn't have a very good computer, only got access to the internet through cafes and at the school. And when all of those things were shut down, he couldn't do his work anymore. And so we, as instructors, we were very flexible with that. Like, how can we support you? How can we get you what you need? Which is not necessarily the way we would always be. But I didn't know that this student had those challenges because he was able to hide it in the background. Whereas when the pandemic came along, that hiding wasn't able to be, he couldn't hide anymore. And so we saw that through our research, the survey respondents said that that's what they were finding, that there was most students lost all the access to technology supports and that was very difficult for them. We also found that the course expectations for instructors really changed over that quick emergency time. So there are certain things in journalism school that you always have to do. You cannot interview your mom. You can't interview your roommates. You have to interview real people. You have to go there yourself. You have to talk to them and put the mic in their face and have that discomfort. And suddenly, you couldn't do that. Maybe you were locked down completely and you actually couldn't leave your house. So what are you going to do now? Oh yeah, actually it's okay if you interview your roommate or your mom, or you attend a city council meeting online, which by the way, that's all the news journalists are doing anyway. So we changed our expectations, and the things that were hard and fast rules, absolutely you cannot do it any other way, suddenly became very flexible. And I wonder, and I'll talk about this a little later, it's like, if it's flexible in the course of a pandemic, why is it not flexible at any other time? So we had talked about that a bit in our research. And then the other piece from this is we knew from the instructors and from my own experience, we had taken away the technology, we'd taken away had become very flexible around what an assignment looked like, but at the same time, the quality of the work declined. So when you think about that, we're going to dig into that a little bit more as we go in through our research in the future. But when you think about that, I have some thoughts. And one of them is, I think the quality of everyone's work in March and April declined. So maybe it's okay to expect that students would also have that reaction. And the takeaways that we got from the research when we asked the the instructors to think about it was, well, maybe we should be more flexible. Maybe we can have more, a wider range of the kinds of technology and the kinds of things that we will accept. If we want to have our classroom keep pace with the newsroom, well, the newsrooms are doing it differently now. So what can we look at? What are the realities on the ground? And how are those reflected in the way we're teaching? So I would say for myself, this idea of the quality declining, I have not seen that decline in my students. I saw a decline for sure in the spring, but this term we're teaching online. We've had a lot of time to think about it and a lot of time to sort of address some of the problems that we know were going to happen from having to do it online. But I would also say that in my own personal experience, I've been much more thoughtful about how to scaffold the skills, how to give them the material that they need in advance, how to make sure that they get to practice a lot before they actually have to do it, because we have this distance between us and you have to build in that extra flexibility. I've also really tried to take a lot of the stress out of it. We heard in our research, and I'm sure that many instructors could say the same thing, some students just dropped. We didn't see them. We would find out that maybe a student who seemed to be doing really well had a very insecure home environment, or they had extra stressors that we just weren't aware of. And so when you look at that, you have to take the stress of the pandemic and the stress of learning new tools online out of it. And I just want to talk about that for a moment when we look forward to the future is, and I'd be interested to hear from my other panelists on this, but why is journalism school so stressful? I was teaching my class this morning and my students, I said, okay, how you guys all doing? And they're like, oh my gosh, we're so stressed out. Everything is crazy. Too many assignments. We're learning 50 tools. We're not learning journalism, and it's always been that way. It was that way when I went to journalism school. We're trying to make it so that you know what to do when you get into a very stressful newsroom by making you exceptionally stressed out before you get there. And when we see what's happening, like the world is very stressful right now. We know all of the things that are going on. So I wonder, couldn't we design it in a way that makes it more supportive and kinder, and so that when the students actually get into the newsroom, they've been able to learn those skills in a way that it's not so stressful. And I also see, to go back to what Teresa Tam was saying yesterday, one of the things she said was that as journalists, being good communicators, we actually can save lives. That's actually what we're being taught to do in journalism school, is to give people information to save lives. So if that's what we're doing, then don't we want students to stick with us and to stay in journalism school and to not feel so stressed out that they do other things. And I will just say one other thing about that. The pandemic stripped away so many of the protective layers that students have. You know, if you have a fight with your partner and your partner's sitting beside you while you're learning class, that's very challenging. So I think that we need to be aware of that as we move forward. And as we move forward, I think that this is just such an incredibly optimistic moment to build it back, you know, to build better, to move forward and say those things didn't work before. They don't work during a pandemic. So maybe we can create something that works better for everyone after. So again, if you want to see the actual numbers, you can look in the documents. And I've tried to keep my optimism, and I've tried to learn new things as we're moving through this. And I really look forward to hearing what my other two panelists think about all of those things and keeping your enthusiasm up.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jennifer. And obviously I'm not a very good television producer, or I would have noticed this note earlier that I think your papers were rubbing against your microphone, but that's okay.
I'm so sorry.
No, that's all right. It only happened a couple times. So Karen, why don't you jump in?
Yeah, well, I think there's a natural segue into what I'm going to talk about, and we've got some shared experience. But clearly I'm bringing a predominantly UK perspective to what I'm going to share today. And I've sort of called this really reflections on the shifting shape of journalism education in the COVID-19 pandemic, because I think I'm talking really here on behalf of a group of colleagues who've done a bit of thinking and reflecting on these things. And we sort of, I don't know, but I think we just sort of want to take stock, I guess, of the experience of living in a story that we were reporting on. And, you know, journalists usually report on crisis, but the pandemic places journalists in that crisis like everyone else. And this unique experience presents us with challenges, which Jennifer has definitely talked about, and I will touch on a couple that are similar. So I thought I'd start by giving a little bit of context and then move into what our reflections were, and then how we've mapped those onto a sort of pedagogic design for this academic year post-lockdown, as we are currently in the UK, but only in certain parts of the UK. So the spark for the reflections that I'm sharing with you today came from the reflections of a BBC journalist, medical editor Fergus Walsh, who, wearing full PPE, reported from the front line of intensive care units in hospitals in London in the heart of the pandemic in March, April over here. He's a seasoned journalist, and he said that he had never been touched so much by a story like this one, or affected so profoundly. And that really made us think about what our students who we were teaching to be journalists whilst living in this crisis must be going through if someone of that veteran status, if you like, was talking very openly and writing about the trauma that he had experienced as a result of reporting on the pandemic. And just a little bit of context from the HE environment over here in the UK, lockdown here started on the 16th of March for the whole country. So within our universities, we were just a few weeks away from what you would call spring break. And in my university, all teaching immediately moved online. We taught until the end of that month online, then we took a 3-week break, and then we came back and returned to complete our teaching through April and May. So the reflections that I'm going to share with you are from that period. Within our Centre of Excellence in Media Practice at BU, as Alan said, I lead the Journalism Education Research Group, which is a small group of colleagues, all with practitioner backgrounds. We're all former journalists. I'm a former BBC journalist. And as a collective, we aim to embrace a wide group of influences and voices within the changing landscape of journalism practice. And we stand for sort of reimagining and rethinking through listening, which again, Jennifer alluded to the importance of. We hope to make timely interventions in debate, but we're very interested in the human side of journalism practice, and that's what brings us together. And there's nothing like a pandemic to make us think about those things. This underpins pedagogic practices with a strong emphasis on community, on voice, on empathy, and on self-reflection. And the pandemic threw this into really sharp focus, as I've said. So I'm just going to share really the essence of our series of reflective essays that we published this summer, and we hope to work into a longer paper. And this was just as lockdown in the UK was easing, and we are now just at a point where parts of the country are going back into what we call tier 3 lockdown. I'll then place those reflections into the framework of pedagogic theory, which indicates where we plan to take the initial reflections and where we have taken some of them this year. In terms of collecting more data, we want to get narrative interviews from students and colleagues that articulate their lived experiences, because we think it's important for the educators to have their voice as well as the students in this. So we reflected on the impact of 5 different areas of our practice as educators. Journalism's normative values was the key one for us, founded on the principle of impartiality, but as Jennifer referred to, these things went out of the window with the pandemic. Suddenly we were thrown into our own stories, living in this story and having to interview people close to us in order to get stories. The second was teaching industry accredited skills. We have a project which is training community reporters, funded by Facebook, and they are not always people who've gone to university, but they are being trained to take their NCTJ, their National Council for the Training of Journalists diploma, an accredited skills diploma here in the UK. And we have a group of those people from all around the country who we were suddenly teaching online. And the whole point of their work is that they're out in the community reporting, but those communities suddenly became their bedrooms. That was a real challenge. The third reflection for us was around original storytelling. How do we keep things original whilst we're part of the story? Squaring again with that objectivity shibboleth that we have as journalists. The fourth reflection was around teaching final year undergraduate students for a module. This was my own particular contribution to the paper, with a focus on marginalised voices, and also the students' own professional developing sort of sense of identity as practitioners. These things again were thrown into a very shifting shape as the pandemic struck. And finally, managing student well-being across all levels, and that would include our cohort of international postgraduate students, many of whom had to get back home while trying to complete really complex investigative journalism assignments. And this made us start to think about what we've come to call a pedagogy of compassion and care. So first of all, I want to talk about how we responded at very short notice to these challenges, then to look at how the reflections are mapping onto our pedagogic response this academic year. So we embrace the subjectivity, just as Jennifer talked about doing, the fact we're living in the story. An example of this was mobile survival videos, which first year students produced with their phones when they were allowed to interview their families, which we don't normally allow. And actually we saw mainstream news organisations doing that in this country, holding long boom mics under aunties' windows and talking to them and doing features about their own families. They didn't have the access to the campus newsrooms, as we've already heard. They couldn't get down into town. Everything had changed. So we asked them to stay at home and create short pieces about their households. And they came up with amazing products. And stories range from one student's social carer mother providing end-of-life support via video chat. Another was a student's interview with her mother, who's a cake decorator, who was facing the fear of 12 months without any income. So, you know, these stories had validity because they were part of the fabric of everything that we're experiencing through the pandemic. Turning now to the community aspect and the Facebook reporters, and looking for new ways of building community from literally from their bedrooms. And I've interviewed a few of them over the past week to see how they're doing. And you know, they're 9 months in doing the same. We shifted the focus there to thinking about contacts building and how you can source stories without getting out, and how you can build resilience, because these are young people who've never had to deal necessarily with grief and loss. And we noted as well that they were quite sensitive to feedback. Normally we would do quite professional, sort of hard-nosed feedback. We had to change the tone of what we were saying to the students whilst upholding standards, because they were taking the feedback differently. We weren't shoulder to shoulder with them, face to face, talking about these things. And the daily diet of news in their patch was causing them some trouble as well. We had to counsel them around that. And then while we focus quite a lot on what students are becoming within J schools, the focus shifted to this idea of belonging and managing well-being. And I think we've concluded that becoming has to wait a little, and we have to think a lot now about belonging, well-being being all about identity and I am, and what am I at this moment in time. When we do look at becoming and discussions on identity, these focused on resilience, trauma training, questioning journalistic authority in the context of crisis, and thinking about whose voices were heard. And then when thinking about inclusivity, some students saw journalists themselves as marginalised. And within my own module, this was a theme of some of their presentations, the idea that journalists, even though in this country they were made key workers, were actually on the margins of their craft. So through offering their own professional perspectives and articulating confidence in the power of their own voices, they became determined to advocate for marginalised people and avoid stigma and stereotype in their storytelling. And this, I think, is a real positive that I'm taking away from the experience of teaching through the pandemic. The final sort of section of this is the international students who really did feel very anxious, quite lost. One said, you know, I'm really struggling. The added complication of working from home with the ghost of COVID hanging around. Another had a carer as a mother, who had to think about, you know, living with frontline health workers and the risk factor of that. So this prompted a really pragmatic response from us in terms of the complexities of the investigative journalism project that those students were working on. And we focused on care and getting through and training them in flexibility, something Jennifer also referred to, and pragmatic responses to crisis, really. So these responses shaped our reflections and the design of our teaching, as I've said. So if I could just go through, the first reflection was this pandemic is a catalyst. It enables us really to redraw the boundaries of the journalistic field. And our pedagogic response to that was training for mobile video, new approaches to storytelling, and teaching through the screen, using a lot of asynchronous material, not always doing things live and in real time for them, so they could engage with it at a time which was suitable for them. Our second reflection was that focus on community that I talked about, and this renewed focus on community, which was very big in the UK, clapping for carers and so on. The pedagogic response to that was focus on sources, building contacts from the ground up. This idea of dynamic practices, as pedagogic theory would refer to it. The third reflection was on the tensions between upholding professional standards and the reception of feedback, and assessment design and feedback mechanisms which need clarity and consistency of tone. And then well-being moved to centre stage. That was our next reflection, and our response to that was that belonging is imperative, becoming can wait, as I've already indicated. Looking for social and pastoral spaces online where we could show a shared empathy, and also where hierarchies were flattened. And we focused a lot on that, on community building with the students in order to focus on issues around well-being. And then that spotlight on marginalised voices and journalism practice. And I wonder whether, you know, if the pandemic marks a sort of epiphany which leaves a mark on all our lives, I wonder whether graduating students' self-stories, this idea that they were very much thinking about their own identity in the world that they're going out into, perhaps more than ever, will shape their future journalistic practice in a way that is more empathetic, focused on listening and critically aware of others. I really got that sense of that developing within the students and actually my colleagues. So our response to that's been to co-create spaces for discussion and exploration to shape our journalistic selves, and to collaborate more, to bring them into the design of what we're doing, and to make things more dialogic rather than telling. And that old apprentice model, which can sometimes be very much at play in J schools. And then that final reflection is compassion as a pedagogical principle. And the way we've responded to this in terms of designing our teaching, which is still online, I'm still teaching online currently, is a flexible design, pragmatic responses, and being realistic, but whilst retaining quality. And again, thinking about making it student focused and sometimes making things less complex as well. That doesn't necessarily mean you're lowering standards to do that, but just, you know, you can have a lot of formative feedback. Everything doesn't have to be assessed. And then the assessment perhaps comes a little later to make things less complex. So to conclude, I would say a powerful emergent theme from our reflections was that community and global outlook, and an emphasis on making sure students are employable, is really important. But that sense of community and global outlook was actually absolutely crucial. And perhaps more importantly, an emphasis on commitment to community and global perspective. A number of students I've spoken to are now working as community reporters in the pandemic, and they've commented on how they see journalism as a force for good, how they feel the human aspects of journalism have become important in the pandemic. And I feel that too for us as educators. And this series of reflections really for me illustrates how our collective interest as a group in the Journalism Education Research Group over here, our collective interest in the human side of journalism has really been placed under a very bright spotlight through this pandemic. And the move into a digital space has encouraged new ways of thinking about community, voice, empathy, about our practice as journalists and as educators. Many of the industry standards are shifting due to this new normal of social distancing, and we see a pedagogy of compassion emerging from our pragmatic responses to crisis, whilst also seeking salience in the stories of others, even when we are part of that story.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, lots to talk about, but let's first of all, let's go to Marin, and then we'll come back and tie all three of these together. Marin?
Thank you. These are just fascinating discussions. I'm enjoying listening to them so much. So I'm thrilled to be joining this conference and to be on this panel. I particularly appreciate being invited. So thanks, Chair Thompson, and thanks, Carlton. So I am a university journalism instructor right now. I teach health writing and co-teach health podcasting in the Center for the Study of Human Health at Emory University. But what I'm going to talk about is not actually about my experience at Emory, which is slightly different from what's been discussed because Emory doesn't actually have a journalism department anymore. So I'm bringing journalistic technique and rigor into a space that doesn't have a lot of journalism education. What I'm going to talk about instead is sort of creating journalistic education around the pandemic on the fly. So in May, I was the creator and the chief instructor for a massive open online course that was called Journalism in a Pandemic, covering COVID-19 now and in the future. It was the brainchild of Rosenthal Alves, who's the director of the Knight Center for Journalism in the Americas at the University of Texas. And the Knight Center is a foundation-funded organization that is perpetually engaged in mounting massive open online courses that are mostly peer-to-peer journalism education. And what that usually means is that the courses are programmed by senior journalists and taken by junior ones on subjects as diverse as data journalism and disinformation and online harassment. There's one beginning just on Monday on digital audio storytelling. Courses are free, they're always entirely non-synchronous, and the center has a commitment to delivering them in multiple languages. So in mid-March, Rosenthal came to me and said that their community of 200,000 existing students was expressing to them that they were about to need help navigating what they thought was coming. And at the point at which we were having this conversation, the coronavirus epidemic was only about 2 months old, maybe 3 months old. The World Health Organization had declared a global pandemic exactly 7 days before. So the Knight Center was pretty prescient in their concerns, and I suddenly had a great deal of work to do. So the usual pattern of the Knight Center courses is to have the senior journalist instructor draw content from their own professional experience. It's mostly delivered in video modules, sometimes with additional materials or workbooks to be worked through. Learning's tested by quizzes, they're delivered at the end of each module, and it's backed up by a fairly low-tech, deliberately low-tech bulletin board space where engagement is driven by discussion questions. And then to incentivize people to stick with the course and complete all the modules, participants can apply to receive a certificate from the Knight Center afterward. So looking at their prototype, I realized fairly quickly that though I've been an infectious disease journalist all of my career, and I have an extremely wide network, there were things that I did not know going into the pandemic and that I would also need to learn. So it wouldn't be responsible to follow their traditional pattern of teaching only out of my own personal experience. So the structure I proposed to them was that for each module, we'd present a video lecture from me, a Q&A between me and some subject matter expert, such as an epidemiologist or a disinformation expert, and then a second Q&A between myself and another journalist who was already covering the pandemic to deliver an additional dose of peer-to-peer learning. And we finalized the syllabus approximately 12 days after they made their first approach to me. We released a video promo 1 week later, and we began producing content to launch the course at the beginning of May. And just to make this even harder on ourselves, the Knight Center determined that all of the course materials would be delivered simultaneously in English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. I do not speak 2 of those languages. So to maximize learning and also speed, the center hired 3 additional instructors who not only translated my materials, but also maintained student communities in each of those languages. And I particularly have to say that all of this would have been impossible without the Knight Center's technical advisor, whose name is Ryan Sagar, who managed the post-production of all the video content, including the translations and the closed captioning. And it also could not have taken place without funding from the World Health Organization, UNESCO, and the UN Development Program, who provided funding especially for the non-English portions and had a particular interest in health disinformation. So we opened the course on the 4th of May, and we discovered that we had attracted almost 9,000 students, which was a record for the center from 161 countries, which means we had attracted participation from most of the nations of the world. And the range of experience of the journalists who participated was incredibly wide, from people who were already science or health reporters but felt they needed a brush up because they sensed what was coming, to people who normally covered education or sports or policing or were the lone general assignment reporter in their area, who suddenly had to become pandemic reporters because, as we've all experienced since the spring, the pandemic has been the only story there is. Sports is a pandemic story now. Education is, policing is, even home design and gardening are seen through the lens of the pandemic as we all lock down and stay at home. So because we crashed the development of the course, I can't say for sure that we went into it with a sense of best practices for distance learning. But what we worked out were strategies and tactics that I think have since been confirmed by the experience of many people who suddenly began teaching online, and certainly by my own experience because I'm teaching remotely now. And some of those practical practices are that asynchronous segments should always be short. I think none of mine were over 15 minutes, and they often were as low as 10. That what we think of as traditional lectures, one-to-many, are pointless online. Most of my video segments were phrased and staged instead as a very personal conversation between myself and all those students. That when slides or graphic content are used, I featured some simple lists and some still and video photography. They should always be available separately offline. And as should, of course, any other non-synchronous content, which for us was curated pieces of journalism and background readings and reports by governments and NGOs. I'm very proud of all the content we provided, but I think the greatest part of the learning that occurred in the course was actually among the attendees themselves, in the gathering space that we offered them, where the conversation was prompted by weekly quizzes and driven by discussion questions. And also in a Facebook group, which is still active now 5 months after the course ended. And there were many students in the developing world where most of their communication is on mobile, not on laptops or desktops. And they have set up a Telegram group, and I believe also a WhatsApp group as well, that also are still going. So what else did we learn? We learned that good video production is important, particularly excellent sound quality, but that the visual portion of video segments don't have to be Bollywood or Hollywood polished. We learned that it's essential to plan for students accessing material on mobile, and particularly for the challenges of low bandwidth. It was necessary sometimes to post very simplified versions of materials. For instance, copying a website into a PDF and stripping out everything except the text. And we learned that streaming can stress bandwidth also, and therefore that transcripts of videos were always crucial. Now, on the upside, we learned that one of the benefits of distance learning for journalism is that it can allow students to have access to experts they would never have been able to interview on their own. My lone student in Nepal probably would not have gotten his email returned by the World Health Organization's chief epidemiologist, but by participating in the course, he was able at least to participate remotely and to watch in an interview that I did with that scientist. And Rosenthal had asked me to leverage my network. So among the other people whom the students got to learn from were the immediate past director of the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the head of vaccine research at Merck. But I think the single biggest lesson for me, and this is one that I am learning again with my current students, is that we have to be prepared to trust remote students to manage their learning themselves. So much of the benefit of the night MOOC was that it allowed participants from all different countries, all different political systems, all different degrees of sophistication of public health to speak very candidly, not just about their reporting experience, but also about the experience of living in their societies at this moment, experiencing the pandemic alongside everyone who is not a journalist. And I've been inspired by that to work with my current students now as I'm teaching remotely. I noticed that when I deliberately program times and spaces for them to speak to each other without my being present and dominating the conversation, except possibly lurking in their breakout rooms without my video on, then they have the most engagement. And I think looking at how our semester is going, the greatest chance of success. So that's what our experience was. I'd just like to mention that though the live MOOC ended on the 31st of May, the material all lives on at the Knight Center site as a completely self-directed course. I think that the link will be available through the symposium's materials. It is still free. It is entirely asynchronous, of course. It is now available in addition to the 4 original languages in Russian, Arabic, and I think Chinese is coming. Because anyone can take the course, the Facebook book group remains open. And as soon as people take it, they are eligible for participation in that now multiple thousand community of journalists worldwide. So that's my report from what it was like to crash journalism education in a pandemic. Thank you very much for listening.
Great, thank you. We called this conference Journalism in the Time of Crisis for a reason. I specifically didn't call it the more obvious, I guess, journalism and the pandemic, even though it is about the intersection of journalism and the pandemic. But my hope is that we're going to draw from this lessons that we can take forward. And the more I listen to you, I wonder, are some of the things we're learning things that we're already that were already in the back of our minds before the pandemic about teaching and the way to teach and approaches, and but it's the pandemic, it's the crisis that has brought us to this point where we have to adapt, we have to change what we're doing, we have no choice. So suddenly we're in this position where, well, we do have to change, so how are we going to do it? And the session just before this one, or earlier this afternoon, was very struck by something Marjorie Roos from Internews said: a crisis is a horrible thing to waste. So it's upon us and we've got to make the most of it. So I guess maybe part of this discussion is about how do we make the most of the period that we are in. We are forced to teach online, who knows, for the foreseeable future, the rest of this academic year for most people, potentially into the next, who knows? So is this kind of our new normal? And so this sharing of what we're doing now and what works, but also I would like to look at, assuming there is a post-pandemic, what are the things that just aren't going to, we're not going to go back to, what will have changed forever and what will be the new normal. So maybe about what we're doing now. We had a good conversation a month or so ago with several newsroom managers, and we were asking them, what should we be doing now in this period in the classroom? What do you think would serve our students as they head out into the workforce? And they said, this is an amazing time for them to be studying journalism in this environment, being forced to work online, because this will turn out people who are innovative, mobile, can work on their own, can deal with isolation, but then it gets a bit self-serving, don't need a big expensive newsroom. You know, maybe news organizations like this shift to people working on their own and in isolation. So I just wonder what you think about that immediate sort of transition. Are we training a new generation of mobile, independent, innovative, self-reliant journalists? Jump in, anyone, or maybe Karen, you were nodding a moment ago.
I would agree. I mean, I think that point about the pandemic as a catalyst, I think it has enabled us to do some things we were thinking about doing possibly, and that I think is reflected in industry as well. I agree with you. There are also some nefarious things that people perhaps wanted to do which aren't so great around, you know, cutting overheads and cutting resource. But I think there's a balance to be struck between the sort of resilience and the opportunity, which is, it's always awful to think perhaps of opportunity within a crisis, but there is an opportunity for young journalists, and many of them I think are making the most of it. But I think as well, we have to think a lot about the effect of what they're doing on them, and building not only resilience is a word that is okay, I think, but resourcefulness and you know, really being able to strike a balance in their own lives. I mean, certainly some, you know, we're talking here about people who are perhaps 20 years old doing the sort of work that they would never have been doing at this stage in their lives, and in their careers, and they are missing out on the mentoring and the water cooler chat and all of those things that, you know, I think the moments of serendipity that come from it being within a physical space as they go out on placement as students, or if they're working as, you know, apprentices, as the community reporters I'm talking about are. So I think we have to be very careful about being gung-ho about that opportunity and handling it with great care. Hence this idea of, you know, the notion of care and compassion on our part as educators, but also I think from within news organisations, it's going to be crucial. I will just say one other thing, having talked to some news organisations myself as well, I think there's a lot of anxiety and worry and concern amongst people who are seasoned professionals, as I indicated in my little spiel at the beginning, and so perhaps there will be change across the board and the hierarchies will flatten across the board as well. I think that's yet to be seen.
I would commend to you the study that Julie Pozzetti released this morning at the conference. I mean, incredible, really the first major survey of journalists during the pandemic, and the overwhelming, grim, grave picture of the way journalists who have been covering the pandemic are feeling. Their sense of stress and anxiety and concern about their jobs and worry about their health is quite overwhelming.
Yeah, I agree. It's a fantastic survey. It's with the Tau Centre, isn't it, as well? It's a brilliant piece of work. Yeah, and it was wonderful that you had that in the conference. I thought it's really important. Yeah. Jen,
what do you think about the time we're in, and just what we're doing to get through this, and how is it serving our students?
As I said before, I try to be an optimist, but I definitely hear what you're saying, Karen. I don't want to be an optimist to the point of pretending like nothing bad is happening. It's more, I think that from my perspective, there were things for me that weren't working as a teacher. I've only been teaching for about 5 years. And so I had sort of thought, okay, well, this is the thing that you do, and you do it this way because this is the way it's always been done, or, you know, like the stressful sort of newsroom anticipate, you know, the way that climate works. So I have that sort of sense of it. And then you think, well, it doesn't really work that well in this case. And so one of the things I've been thinking about quite a lot is this idea of building community. I have started a new job at UBC this year, but we can't go to campus. So I know some of the people who work there because I've met them before, but there are moments where I might pop my head in somebody's office and say, hey, do you have a second? I want to introduce myself. I want to chat. I want to have, you know, the water cooler moment. And so I'm very empathetic to students who now are part of this community, but they've never seen anybody in real life. They have to make an appointment to meet their classmates, and they can't just say, oh my gosh, isn't that crazy, or isn't this happening? So how do we build those communities? And I think that's part of building resiliency. I think also there are some opportunities. There's not a lot of journalism learning online for lots of reasons, but if you know, there's not a lot of master's programs or distance journalism programs. There's some MOOCs, but it's not something that people could do. And one of the things we were looking at our school is there are a lot of people in small communities who already live in small communities and they want to be journalists, but they don't necessarily want to move to a place like Vancouver where it's very expensive for 2 years to do the journalism training. But the people who live in Vancouver don't necessarily want to move to a community that has 5,000 people in it to be journalists. So I see this as an opportunity where we can figure out how to do that training really well. And then suddenly this sense of community and building those skills could mean that we are building a more robust small community news network, because maybe you could connect those communities through that network. So I think right now we're trying to get through it, but a lot of the things we can do to build a more equitable journalism school or to build a better distance journalism school will actually serve to make journalism as a whole stronger and more robust down the road.
I mean, Marin, you've been doing this with thousands of people at a time, right? Exclusively online. So are you just way ahead of us?
I don't think so, but so much of what all of you just said has resonated with me. I was profoundly struck, Karen, when you said a pedagogy of compassion, because that to me just seems so essential to what we're doing right now. So just to underline, you know, I am not teaching in a journalism program. My students are probably, I think for the most part, are probably not going to become professional journalists, but we hope that they will take the skills and rigor of journalism into working for, you know, their pre-med and pre-public health, or they're going to go work for international NGOs and things like that. We want to imbue them with journalism values in addition to writing skill. They are so stressed. They are so overworked. and I am sympathetic to that, because I am myself, in addition to being a part-time professor, I am a full-time working journalist, and I don't think I've left my desk before midnight since February. So I have tried in real time this semester to figure out what are the core things that they most need to learn, and what can I let go of, as Jennifer has been saying. I have to say, in the before time, I would have been punitive about the missing deadlines, and now they tell me they can't get their interviews because it takes 4 tries to get someone to answer their email. And you know, and I just kind of quietly zeroed out the punitive deadline portion of the syllabus for the rest of the semester. The things that I hope they are taking away will be the degree to which, as you're both saying, the degree to which journalism can be a community, even a distanced community. As I said in my remarks, I notice when they are completely transformed when I program in opportunities to get them to talk to each other, to talk out their work to each other. They come alive, they are engaged, they are obviously more interested in what we're doing. And I am hopeful we can find more ways to stimulate that response and discard the ways in which we were sort of suppressing their creativity and boring them. I feel like I'm still sort of groping my way to exactly how we do that, though.
That is something I really wonder about, though, is creating that, who referred to the gathering space, you know, the place where they can meet virtually. We've all just spent the last 2 days on Zoom in the course of this conference. There seems to be a lot of conformity around the platforms and the tools that we're going to use. Are there spaces or tools or techniques that that we haven't thought of that would work better to create that kind of community or environment when people cannot be physically present with each other? Jump in, anyone? Yeah, Jen.
I was going to say, I have been looking at various tools. I definitely agree with Marin. When my students have an opportunity to be in a breakout room, and I do lurk, and then when they notice me, they are surprised. But when they have an opportunity to be in a breakout room, it's like they're working in a group in a classroom. They feel a lot more comfortable experimenting with some of the material that we're teaching. I think that generally that works better than discussion posts, because I find the discussion post is sort of more formal and they're scared to be criticized because it's in print and will be seen there for a long time. But one of the things, you know, you mentioned about tools, and one of the pieces of information I've been getting from my students is that we all instructors went away for the summer and we all learned new tools. And then we came in and they're taking 5 classes and each instructor has a different way that they want them to interact. So one class is Slack and one class is Padlet, and then we've got Discourse and we've got all these other things. And so they're spending so much time learning those tools that they're not learning the journalism, and they've been told to go in so many places that they can't keep them straight. So I think it's amazing that we have all these tools, but I feel like and we might need to, at least each program might need to coalesce around 1 or 2 of them so that it doesn't become about learning the tool, it becomes about the community.
Yeah, I'm worried about that. We had those conversations over the summer, that overload of, you know, all the whizzy things. We were doing all these workshops and sharing, you know, lots of this. The research centre I'm part of does a lot of work with online teaching and has done for years. Actually, as you know, Jen, because our doctorate is online. But, you know, it's very different when you're talking to large groups of undergraduate students. And so we did sort of have a bit of a conversation about just keeping it as calm as we could. And that's why I'm really interested in the sort of themes that come out of this, and whether we, you know, there's that idea of simplifying without lowering standards, you know, to Marin's point about, okay, if the deadline is not such a thing, you know, what is? And I do think, you know, as an optimistic sort of point, that there is a lot that they are taking away and learning that might have been subliminal or something they reflected on post-graduation that now is quite central to their experience, as long as we can not overload them with the technology. And, you know, the sorts of things I was talking about, I do think are really there, and they are very, very, they're thinking in that way. I think they're thinking in different ways, potentially. And my experience is that they are engaging in big groups as well as in breakout rooms. They're desperate to have the connection, because life is quite simple for them outside. There's not a lot going on. The pubs close here at 10 o'clock at night. You know, you can't do a lot. So you might as well be meeting in those communal spaces online. But I think simplicity is key, absolutely.
When you talk about the things that we now realize we need to change because of the crisis that we're in, I do wonder, so Carleton's Journalism School is celebrating its 75th anniversary, right? That's part of the reason we're holding this conference. But does that mean we've been doing this wrong for 70 some years? Like, because I know I've been here 18 years, and before that I was a reporter at the Toronto Star, and, you know, I think some of my learning on the job, my remote learning as a reporter, probably came from a grouchy editor on the phone in Toronto shouting at me, you know, what's this lead? You know, you're not a typist, you're a journalist. We don't pay you to type. And even pedagogically in journalism school, I mean, until very, very recently, we were actually trying to create a stressful environment, not to mitigate the stress, right? The pedagogy of compassion was a concept that, you know, we were literally creating a test tube to impose stress upon students with deadlines and with these demands that have to be met, or you might get an F or a deduction in your grade. And so has this just made us realize that maybe we've got to shift away from that model? This is not just something that we're having to adapt because of the pandemic, that maybe that model didn't work. Is that what you were suggesting, Karen? Is that the move to the pedagogy of compassion?
And I think I've always had an interest in sort of participatory websites such as Global Voices and the work that they do. We do a lot of work with the Salzburg Academy for Media and Global Change. And, you know, I think the sort of thinking, the talking and the discursive nature, the dialogic nature of teaching within those environments, and the sorts of things that have been going on in your MOOC, Marin, with such large numbers of people, you know, I do think that that could be front and center of what's going on within J schools. there is a tension though. We have accrediting bodies here, just as you have accreditation in the US and in Canada, I believe. So, you know, there's always that tension. We're always having to try to lead the change from within the J schools. But I think the key is not to be turning out another generation of journalists who were just the same, because that just isn't going to work. And in that sense, the pandemic really is a catalyst. I think the sort of work you're doing within your MOOC is really exciting, particularly with people who may not even end up being journalists. You know, there's a lot to be said for those transferable skills, I think, as well.
So, you know, I think a lot about this question that you've all raised of what this moment is teaching us and what it is showing us we can sacrifice. Because like you, Alan, you know, I was trained in the kind of city room environment where your editor yelled at you across the room and threw staplers if you didn't respond fast enough, and ripped copy out of, you know, your hands or something like that. You know, looking back, I mean, it certainly made me an extremely precise reporter. I never messed with the you know, I never had cause to question, again, things that I was made to look up in the style book, right? I had them practically tattooed on my skin. But how much of that, you know, now that I look back, how much of that was abusive and not actually, you know, useful to did it actually create better journalism? It made me a journalist of the last quarter of the 20th century, because that's the way we made journalists then. But did it actually make my product better? I'm not sure. So this question of like, how do we respond to this moment and be compassionate to our students, but not be soft on them and not reduce our standards? I'm not sure that I hear any. I think we're all aware of the problem and of the potential for growth, but equally aware of the dangers. And it doesn't sound like any of us have solved that yet.
Do you think, could I ask you a question, Marin? Do you think perhaps there is a sort of, I agree with you, I don't think we have got the solutions. I think these are all things we're tussling with, aren't they, and reflecting on, and we're all in it ourselves. But do you think there's a sort of an element of changing practices? I'm thinking particularly about the way that students are now having to build a relationship with sources in a very different way in the first place. You know, we know it's very difficult for them to even have the confidence to perhaps pick up a phone, something we have to teach, but that's the only way that they're really engaging with people. And then because of the nature of the stories they're covering, quite often, you know, they're learning very quickly. You don't just smash and grab and go and take a story and then drop the person and take what you need for your quote. You build a relationship, you might need to go back to them. I just wonder whether longer term they are learning to be, you know, better journalists than those of us perhaps who were bawled at by an overmighty news editor.
Well,
And
they're
that's
probably learning to be better human beings.
And better human beings. Well,
and maybe that will learn to them being, you know, so I am a former fellow of the Dart Center at Columbia.
I work with
this is the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, having been, you know, an infectious disease reporter, an epidemics and disasters reporter my entire career, and their counsel of how to their championing of how to conduct trauma-informed journalism. To be sensitive to sources, to not take advantage of sources, to not re-traumatize people is something that I think about all the time these days, because in a way, we are all doing trauma journalism now, right? And having to be, needing to be informed of the ways in which we do not re-traumatize the people we are interviewing or writing about is so critical. So to the degree that any of our students learn that as a result of this experience, I have to believe that they will be better journalists, in addition to being better human beings.
Yeah, I completely agree with that.
I have a couple of questions that have popped up on the question board here. One from Tule Ate, to all the panelists. What do you think about the new media mania in Turkey, where I live and teach? The departments named New Media are opening under faculties of communication. He says he doesn't agree with that and wonders what you think. Anyone want to jump in?
I'll give it a go. But I mean, I think it's a difficult one because I think that you might just have different cultural takes on that. I mean, I think it's something which I would not have a problem with, and we integrate new media into everything that we do within a department of communication and journalism and a faculty of media and communication. So I don't think it's something to be concerned about, but I'm not sure where the concerns are coming from in terms of the question. So.
Okay, and I do have another, Alexander Javier or Javier, and I'm sorry, Alexander, your name came up in another panel and I'm not sure I said it right that time either. So the question, I'm an undergraduate student at the University of Toronto pursuing a double major in economics and political science, currently in my 4th year. Would have been great if I could have taken my second major or minor in a journalism program. Could universities create some sort of agreement between each other to incorporate an online journalism program? And Jen, you were kind of alluding to this, but in a slightly different way about reaching remote communities where people might not otherwise be able to pursue a career in journalism. But in this case, you know, someone who's pursuing another discipline but would like to look at doing journalism online.
Well, I don't know if that's what's going to come out of this, but I think that there aren't a lot of opportunities to do journalism programs online, at least in Canada. I can think of the journalism schools we have here, and I don't think that they offer, you know, unless you're registered as a journalism student, there's not a sort of, you know, Athabasca University or a master's degree of journalism for lots of reasons, because it was not considered easy to teach journalism online for all sorts of hands-on technical reasons. So I guess I wonder if now we're working towards getting around those things because we're forced into doing an online sort of teaching of journalism. What is to stop someone's school from putting together an actual way that students like that at the U of T, who's not in a journalism school, could do that? Or you could have, you know, there's lots of journalism part-time studies program. Why is there not an online part-time studies program? Because if we're figuring out these pieces, could we not figure them out just to get away from those logistical problems that people come into contact with when they're trying to learn journalism? So, you know, maybe you don't want to move, or maybe you want to do it part-time. There's lots of ways. So if we figure it out for now, I wonder if we can figure it out for the future.
I wonder the same. I mean, and some of the inequities of who gets to study journalism in a university context. You can't do that if you're in a remote community that you're not able to leave, or that you don't want to leave, or it's very difficult to do that. For example, if it means you have to move across continents to take the program that you want to take. So, I mean, right now we have a number of international students who are doing our program from their family homes. They may have been in Canada and gone back for the pandemic. We have 14 students working on the publication documenting this conference. 2 of them are international. One is doing a podcast about the conference from her family home in Dubai, and the other is covering the event from New Delhi. And they're both doing a great job. So it does make you wonder, I think, can we now, a year ago, if someone had said, we will teach our entire curriculum online, we would have thought, how would we ever do that? Well, we are doing it. And I do wonder what the post-pandemic version of that is. And presumably it's not just going back to doing everything the way we used to do it before.
I think it's also the idea about removing barriers from learning journalism. There are quite a few barriers that have been put in place, and you know, sometimes that's a financial barrier. You've learned journalism, but you're going to go into communication. It's a geographical barrier. There's lots of reasons why students don't necessarily go through. Sometimes, you know, where I live in Vancouver, it's incredibly expensive. So students are working 2 jobs to live here as well as doing journalism school. So if we can remove some of those barriers, maybe we can have more journalism students and more journalists who want to stay in journalism. And then that in the end would be so much better for the industry as a whole. You could bolster that up in lots of ways. So I'm excited to see. I'm not presuming that I'm the one that's going to figure out how to launch journalism online university, but I'm excited to see how that's going to work out.
Okay, a couple questions popping in. Ooh, a few questions all at once. Ellen Bessner, prof at Centennial College in Toronto. Your findings mirror a lot of what we're seeing. The important takeaway from your webinar has been compassion, trying to lower the stress of deadlines, which we are hearing from our students too. Wonder if you can discuss more about how you handle assignment story deadlines, because having deadlines helps students to juggle the requirements from all their other courses while also teaching them a key skill that newsrooms will need from them when they go out. So how far do you bend on the deadlines?
Is that for me? So the funny thing is that just this morning I sent, so we use the Canvas online platform at Emory. And so I sent an announcement to my students in Canvas saying, okay, kids, look, I have been, you may have noticed that I have been flexible about deadlines because the semester is a hellscape and I know you are stressed, but we are coming to the end of the semester and therefore we are going to run out of time to be flexible. So as much as you got, I allowed you to be flexible in the first part of the semester, the second half of the semester, we're actually in the last third. We are going to have to be tougher because you have to turn in work and I have to give you a grade. So, part of what they've been reporting back to me, and remember, these are not journalism students. So for most of them, my course is the first time they've ever written a piece of popular writing or non-academic writing. And the first time they've ever conducted an interview. So I understand that there are this is very much 101. And there are things that I might've done as a baby journalist that they have no acquaintanceship with at all. But I know as someone who also is a working journalist that it's taking me 3 and 4 times to get sources to respond to me now. So and I am tough because I have done this a long time. So how can I expect the students to how can I score them down if they email a potential source twice and can't get an interview out of that? It's just unrealistic. So this is very much ad hoc, and I very much hope my chair is not listening. But for each of them, because I fortunately have a relatively small class, I have 20 students. We work out individual plans for when they're going to hit lots of sort of interstitial milestones, and somehow we get there. At least we've gotten there to this point. Would that be successful in a class of 100 students in Journalism 101? Probably not. Fortunately, I don't have to teach that class. This is all very ad hoc for me.
Janice Neal, my counterpart colleague at Ryerson, she's responding to what we were saying a moment ago about we have international students who can take our program. She says, yes, but it's easy to cover events from around the world when everything is, i.e. conferences, online events, when everyone's covering things online. As we return to the world of face-to-face, won't we still privilege reporters doing firsthand observations?
But how much are we going to return to face-to-face? So granted, I'm in the US and our pandemic is worse than most of the rest of the world. But universities are all staying online for the spring. Large corporations aren't going back to their offices until maybe sometime in the summer. Who knows when restaurants in the United States are going to come back? It's very likely that major scientific conferences are going to stay online for the foreseeable future. So yes, I understand. I think I understand the point underneath the question, but I don't know how soon we are, in fact, going back to the option of doing journalism face-to-face. Though, again, this is US specific.
I do wonder if there's going to be a hybrid. Jen, jump in.
I was going to say that I think that it will be a yes and. I mean, when you look at the news, even before the pandemic, you saw way more Skype interviews, you saw way more interviews from afar, and now that has just been more integrated into the news. So if we're teaching students what they need to do to work in a newsroom, what they need to do to work in a newsroom is sometimes figure out a way to have a video interview that's going to be integrated into your story. But when you're doing a longer feature or you're doing an investigative piece, of course, you're still going to figure out a way to do that face-to-face. And we're still we're figuring out a way to do that now by sitting very far apart and having your crew wear masks. So I think that we will go back to that, but we will also have the additional tool of doing distance interviews as a tool in the toolbox, because that's what we're seeing in newsrooms. So we need to do, we need to train students to do what we will see there. But I don't want my students to not ever have the experience of sitting down and asking someone tough questions across a room from them, because I think that that's a really worthwhile and difficult skill to cultivate.
I have a unit, a day when I'm teaching writing narrative, where I talk about the importance of gathering and conveying sensory detail. Well, if they're never going to be they're not going to be in the same room with people, so they won't know what it smells like, or what their clothing looks like, or what the surround is like. It's very difficult to figure out how to integrate that into how to write narrative in a time of pandemic.
Though increasingly I hear of people asking the source they're interviewing, would you mind just looking out the window and telling me what's going on? Can you just grab your phone and take some pictures of yourself, and maybe go down the hall and, do the cutaways? And so it's happening. Jen Ivor Shapiro, also at Ryerson, says, I agree with Jennifer. Wonder if J Schools Canada could coordinate member schools' efforts in creating an online journalism program or international minor or something. Carleton, Ryerson, Kings, Mount Royal, and so on, many others could take their best online courses and make them available. What do you think of that idea?
I think you should talk to some people at J Schools Canada about which I guess I am now on the board of it, but I would take that to the meeting. I mean, there could be a collaboration. I mean, that could be something that we do, where you could, maybe some of the programs like you're talking about, they could collaborate and maybe put something together. I think that that's a possibility if people are willing to put in the time and the work.
There's another question here it's on the same theme, but it's maybe more pragmatic, that this pedagogy of compassion right now at this moment might well mean giving students a break when it comes time to calculate their grades at the end of this term. There are a lot of students who are just incredibly stressed out, and their cumulative screen time day by day can be 8, 9, 10, 12 hours in front of a screen. And it's a lot. And are we just going to have to cut them some slack during this time?
So at Emory, a lot of US institutions did this to different degrees, but at Emory, we slid our semester forward, I think 3 weeks. So we began in the middle of August. We eliminated our fall break. And we're sending the students home at American Thanksgiving. It's at the end of November. So that means that they've had a sprint of 14 weeks with no break. And so we are, I think I have 4 more classes to go. They are exhausted. I mean, I can just hear the sand in the gears of their brains. And they tell me that they're on screens, 10 hours a day. And most of my students are either in newly single dorm rooms, or they're in local apartments, but I have one in Ghana and one in Korea and one in China. Those 3 actually probably have a better chance of going out in the world than the ones in the US do, sadly. So they seem to be more tired because of all the screen time than they would, I think, if they even had this much class time and homework, sort of in the way we did it in the before times.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say that one way perhaps of alleviating that stress is just, and what we've tried to do is integrate more formative feedback and less of the summative feedback. So everything doesn't carry a grade, but feeds forwards into the final grade. So there's that. It was really to the point you were making earlier about lifting deadlines, having a sort of being a little more slack early on, maybe building portfolios, different techniques so that it's not constant, hand in hand in assessment. And that seems to be working quite well, but we start later than you. So we're, a little earlier into our semester at the moment. We don't finish until mid-December. But I do think formative feedback is a really useful way of engaging students in supporting them whilst not carrying a grade with it, which creates stress.
I just want to remind you and everyone watching, if you have the time at 7 o'clock, so after this session ends, we are having an open town hall for journalism students, which is a very informal session, not webinar format. Everyone will be there and can have their cameras on if they want to and have a chance to talk. So that's coming up at 7 o'clock after this session. In the few minutes that we have left, I thought I might just ask each of you in the same sort of order as we started off, just to kind of wrap up. What do you think is the most important lesson for journalism education that we take forward from this period? Jen?
I would say probably to be flexible with not only expectations, and I don't mean in the sense of lowering them, but be flexible and responsive to whether it's what's happening in the newsroom or what's happening in the world or what's happening in the background with students. Like Marin said, because you will allow people to be better humans. And don't we want better humans to be the people in the newsrooms? Like, by creating better journalism like a better atmosphere for journalism students, I think eventually over time we will create a better atmosphere for newsrooms, and therefore the information that the public gets is going to be better. So it will just, I think being flexible and understanding that will help moving forward.
Karen?
Yeah, well, I agree with that. I mean, obviously very clear. I think that I'm really interested in the human side of journalism and that idea of empathy. But I think perhaps to take away from this the sense of community that has built, and that people do understand, you know, that they can serve really very small areas really well with their journalism and their storytelling, and finding ways of doing that which are original but also meaningful. And then, you know, I think we build a sort of mosaic of really great community journalism could come out of this. I see some really great work going on at ground level with particularly young community reporters. So I really hope that that will continue to build along with those notions of empathy and compassion that I've talked about a lot today.
Great, thank you. Marin?
I feel like I haven't got anything to say that hasn't already been said. This question of how do we bring in flexibility? How do we actually enshrine compassion as a value of journalism management? When it was so foreign to the way we ran newsrooms for so long, certainly every newsroom I ever worked in. The problem of how we transfer the things that we used to take for granted about the way that we trained people in a hands-on, face-to-face, you know, almost apprenticeship kind of model, and how we transfer that to an overwhelmingly distanced model, which, as you say, Alan, is likely to go on for the indefinite future to some degree. I think this is extremely challenging. I don't think, as Karen said, that we have the answers to this yet, but I do feel that you know, sort of a kind of counter set of values that will underlie that is starting to bubble up, and that actually gives me a lot of hope for the profession going forward.
Well, thank you. I want to thank all of you. This is the final formal panel session from an unrelenting 2 days of journalism in the time of crisis. So thank you very much, Jen, Karen, and Marin, for joining us for this panel on journalism education. I think it's pretty significant that we ended this sort of examination of the intersection of journalism and the pandemic by talking about what this means for journalism students and journalism education, because they're going to carry this forward. So again, thank you very, very much. And for those who want to tune in at 7 o'clock, we have a town hall for journalism students. Thanks very much. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.